Hello YouTube, this is UMOZO3. So now we're on to lesson 7 in the Python curriculum. And in the previous lesson, we built up an understanding of Boolean expressions. Okay, we were talking about Boolean expressions, which are basically expressions that either evaluate to true or false. And so we're sort of going to try to pick up from where we left off with all of that, because the goal now is going to be to develop if and else if statements. And basically we can have our code run in a particular way depending on the values of Boolean variables and expressions within our code. So let's just hop right into it and I'll show you what I'm talking about. The first thing I wanted to tell you about though is the use of a multiple line comment. Okay, so basically there is no traditional multi-line comment in Python. Okay, so far, if we have wanted to write multiple comments, we have written hashtag at the beginning of each line, right? So that's essentially what we have going on there. But there's something called doc strings, and we're actually going to have a lesson about doc strings and how they work and what they should include. But basically, for now, it suffices to say that you can actually have a multiple line comment as long as you envelop it in 3 sets of double quotes. So what you could do is you could say this is a multiple line comment, okay? And so basically this would tell Java that for these 6 lines, for everything in between the 3 pairs of double quotes, that this would go ahead and be a multiple line comment rather than something that Python would interpret and try to print to the console. So hopefully you're sort of familiar with that and that makes sense to you, but that's called a doc string, but we're going to be studying it in more detail in a future video. I think I'm going to have a lesson on doc strings, but for right now, you can just think of it as a multi-line comment. The only thing you need to do is just envelop it in 3 pairs of quotes. That's not to be confused with if you had said print, right? So now if you envelop a print around these 3 pairs of double quotes, well, now we would just go ahead and print that multiple line string. So you can see the difference there. But if you're just trying to do a multiple line comment, you don't write print, you just have the 3 sets of quotes and then all the comment stuff is in between. And then you don't see any of that stuff printed on the console. You just see some examples that I was playing around with earlier. So let's talk a little bit more about Boolean expressions and Boolean variables, and we'll sort of try to review some of the things we said in the previous lesson. So remember, if you go ahead and say something like print of 3 plus 3 greater than 6, we would expect this to return false, to print false, because it's not true that 3 plus 3 is greater than 6. That's an example of a Boolean. And then we said that we can also compare strings lexicographically. So what if you wanted to try to see whether or not Toby appeared before Cameron in the dictionary? So now if you go ahead and run this, we should see 2 falses. The first false is for the idea that 3 plus 3 is greater than 6. And the second false is for the idea that Toby would show up before Cameron in the dictionary. So that's an example of lexicographical, right? And so we can have equals then, greater than, less than, greater than or equal to, or less than or equal to. And then we also talked about the operation of this word not. And so basically we say that the not keyword basically inverts the value of a Boolean expression. Okay, so now if you had said something like print not of Toby less than Cameron, now what you can do is you can try to print the inverse of that Boolean. And for that one, you would go ahead and return true, because not of false is true. And you can see that quite literally, right? If you said print of not true, it would say false. If you said print of not false, it would go ahead and say true. Okay, so hopefully you understand that. Hopefully that's making sense to you. What if you said x equals 6 and then x plus equals 3, and then you said print of x greater than 7? If you had run line 3 before line 4, right, if you had printed x greater than 7 just after you initialized it to 6, it would return false. But as a result of this in-place operator, which we studied in the previous lesson, we're incrementing the current value of x by 3 to basically change it to a 9, and then 9 is greater than 7, so that's why we get a true there. And then we also said that we can go ahead and combine Booleans. So we can combine Boolean expressions. We can combine Boolean expressions if we use the keywords or and. Okay, so we essentially say, and then we can also create Booleans, which Boolean variables, right? We create variables which will hold Boolean expressions. So let's go ahead and try to combine those 2 ideas. So if you basically say A is the idea that 400 mod 20 is equal to 0, and B is the idea that 4 is greater than or equal to 17, then if you go ahead and say print of A or B, then this returns true if at least one of A and B is true, right? But then if you say print of A and B, this would return true if and only if both A and B are true. And so we saw an example of how the and or keywords work, and you can see in PyCharm those keywords show up in orange. What also showed up in orange is when we had an escape sequence. Remember when we did a \n, those two characters would show up in orange. So basically you can see that different expressions, different quantities and terms here are showing up in different colors because they mean different things to the interpreter. So here, if you said print of A or B, you get true. If you get print of A and B, you get false, okay? And then what we can do is we can establish some theory about Booleans. So for all Booleans A and B, what we're gonna do is we're gonna say not of A and B is equivalent to not of A or not of B. So this is something that's called De Morgan's laws. This is called De Morgan's laws. But basically, if you basically take the opposite of saying that two things are both true, then that's equivalent to either saying that the first thing is not true or that the second thing is not true. And then if you say, for example, not of A or B, so if it's not the case that at least one of A and B is true, then it's not the case that A is true, and it's not the case that B is true. What we can also say is that we can say A or true is equal to A, right? I think we might have brought this up briefly in the previous video, but basically combining true with an or statement means true, okay? Because basically once you get that true statement, then certainly if you're looking for at least one of the Booleans to be true, then if true is true, then you're all set. And then if you say so A or true, sorry, this would be true. And then A and true would just be A. So this would be the value of the Boolean A, right? If you say A or false, this would be A as well. This would be the value of the Boolean A. But then if you say A and false, this would be a false. This would be basically a disqualifier. And so hopefully you're understanding that. What we can also do is we can also think about the principle of double negation. This says that not of A is just equal to A. So essentially that means basically that two wrongs make a right. So what if you say basically D is the idea that T does not occur before F in the dictionary, or does not occur after F in the dictionary. It occurs at F or before F. So this is an example of a true Boolean, right? So if you print not of D, then we would go ahead and get the output here. So we would expect true, this is T less than or equal to F, right? So this will be false because T occurs after F in the dictionary, right? So not of false, if something is not false, it's true. And then if something is not true, then it's false. So that's why it prints false for that third command there. And then we had these other two print statements up here, but then if we delete those, then we just get that false that we're looking for. So hopefully those sort of operations on Boolean variables are making sense to you. What I wanted to talk about briefly, just for a few minutes, is this idea of another data type conversion. So I said at the end of the last lesson that we were going to look at one more thing. Okay, so for example, for any item or value X, so it could be a Boolean or not. Okay, so if X is a Boolean, so like a true or false expression, then bool of true is true and bool of false is false. Okay, so here, let me just show you exactly what I mean by that. So if you print bool of true, then it basically just returns that Boolean value. Okay, so let's just go ahead and delete that line of code. So you just say bool of true, right? And then if you say bool of not true, then it would just tell you false, right? So just basically, if you say Boolean of a Boolean, it just gives you that Boolean. That's not very exciting. But then what we can also say, if X is not a Boolean, then bool of X is true if and only if X is not equal to 0. So let me tell you what I mean by that. If you say print of 0.3, print of bool of 0.3, bool of anything except two things will return true. So there's only two things that you put into the bool function that return anything other than true. Either bool of false or bool of 0. If you call bool of anything else, then it's going to evaluate to true, right? So this would be bool of false right here. So this would be false. but then bool of anything else will be true. Bool of a negative number, if you say print bool of 1, right, that would just be a go ahead and be true, right? If you say print bool of string of 45, right? So it's basically taking an integer and converting it to a string, and then it just calls the bool function on that, and it's true. But then if you say print 452 minus 452, it would go ahead and say false there, okay? Or no, sorry, it would say that was just printing the arithmetic expression. But what if you said bool of 0? Bool of 452 minus 452 is false. And then finally, print bool of false. I think we already saw that. But these are the only two things. Those are the only two inputs. So then bool of 0 is false is the only one of two things that returns false. So bool of 0 is false, bool of false is false, bool of anything else is true. So hopefully you understand Boolean expressions, Boolean variables, and then also this bool data type. Okay, so hopefully you can understand that. What we want to talk about is if-else. So basically, we can have code run conditionally upon the value of certain Boolean expressions or variables. So let me give you an example. What I'm going to do is I'm going to say x is equal to 53. And I'm going to say if x is greater than 40, print of x plus large. Okay, so what this is going to do is this is an example of an if statement. Okay, and there's a little bit of a PEP issue going on here. So blank line at the end of a file, right? So that's just an example of a PEP thing. It's an etiquette thing, so don't worry about it. But basically what this does is the way an if statement works. So if accepts a Boolean, okay? If the Boolean is true, then the code within the if statement will run. If the Boolean is not true, then the code within the if statement will not run. Okay, so if you go ahead and run this code, you could go ahead and run it. So you could go ahead and say x is large, but then if we go to change x equals 53, and then what if we say minus equals 30? So now x is going to be changed to 23, and then this Boolean x greater than 40 is no longer true. So now you don't print anything on the console. It just tells us that there were no issues. Okay, so hopefully you understand what's going on with that. That's basically a basic if statement, okay? And if statements can be run independently. So if x is equal to 53, you could say if x is greater than 40, print x is large. And then you could have another one. If x is equal to 80, you could print x is gigantic. And then you could have another one. If x is equal to is greater than 20, print x is at least kind of large. Okay, so now if you go ahead and run this code, these if statements will be evaluated independently. So two of these Booleans are true and one of them is false. So these two print statements are going to run. But since this Boolean here in the middle failed, the second one is not going to run. We can talk about a variation of an if statement, and we can also have an if-else statement. Okay, so basically, with an if-else block, we will run the if code if the Boolean is true. If the Boolean is not true, we will run the else code. So let me tell you what I mean by that. I'm going to say A is equal to Miranda, okay? And then what I'm going to say is if A is less than egg, then I'm going to go ahead and say happy, okay? And then otherwise, I'm going to go ahead and print sad. So essentially, if you have an if-else block, basically if the Boolean was true, then you'll run the if code and not the else code. If this Boolean is false, then you'll run the else code and not the if code. So else provides an alternative body of code to run if the if Boolean is not true. So hopefully that makes sense to you, and hopefully you can have an understanding of what's going on with that. So then what we can go ahead and do is we can go ahead and run it. And here we would go ahead and print sad because it's not true that Miranda would appear before egg in the dictionary. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So you would go ahead and get sad here. And then if we go ahead and change this to a greater than, then it would be a true Boolean. We would say that Miranda shows up after egg in the dictionary, so you'd get happy instead. So hopefully you can understand what this if-else block is doing. So basically it evaluates this Boolean. If it's true, it just runs the if code and ignores the else code. If it's false, it just runs the else code and ignores the if code. What if you have an else if? So we're going to talk about something called elif. Okay, it's actually called elif in Python. In Java, you write out else if. It's actually two different words, but in Python, it's elif. So what an if elif block works according to this. So basically, the if statement still accepts a main Boolean, and then if the Boolean is true, the if code will run. Okay. if the main Boolean is false, then the elif Boolean will be checked. Okay, at that point, if the elif Boolean is true, the elif code will run. If the elif code is false, then the code will be done with that entire if elif block. So let me show you what I mean by that. What we're going to do is we're going to say w is equal to 10, and then we're going to say if w is greater than 12, print of w is very large or something like that. We're just going to come up with examples here to demonstrate a point. But then you're going to say if otherwise, if w is greater than 8, you're going to go ahead and say print of w is kind of large. Okay, so here's what this code is going to do. It's going to evaluate it to see if w is greater than 12. If w is greater than 12, it's just going to print w is very large and not worry about this else if. If w is not greater than 12, it's going to evaluate the else if Boolean. If the else if Boolean is true, it'll run the else if code. If the else if Boolean is false, it'll be done with this entire block. Okay, so basically evaluate if Boolean. If true, do if code and not elif code. If false, evaluate elif Boolean. If that Boolean is true, do elif code. Okay. If both Booleans are false, we do not run any of the code, but at maximum, we will be running one of the blocks. So you would never ever run the if code and the elif code. At most, you would run one of them, and if neither of the Booleans are true, you would run neither of them. So now if we go ahead and print this, it says w is kind of large, and we can go ahead and remove some of the other print statements from earlier, but right now we're just looking at the last one to be printed to the console. So it would say w is kind of large because the first Boolean failed, but the second one was true. What if we had made w 17? Now both of these Booleans are true, but still only the if block will be evaluated because else if was only evaluated if the main Boolean failed. So now if you go ahead and run this, we only get w is very large, and it doesn't matter that w is also greater than 8, because the fact that w means greater than 12 means that we're going to run the if code, and that's that. What if w had been 5? Then both of these Booleans fail, and then you don't see anything printed to the console at all. Okay, and then you can basically play around with this by putting trues and falses in here. So you could say, you know, obviously if true, the w is very large would obviously print. But if you put falses for both of them, then you don't get anything, right? And then if you print true, if you have else if true, then you just get the kind of large. So you can go ahead and put constants there and try that out for yourself. The last thing I'll do is you can say an if else block. So what the if else block is, what you would do is you would evaluate the if Boolean, okay? If true, run the if code and nothing else, okay? If the if Boolean is false, evaluate the elif Boolean, okay? If the elif Boolean is true, run only the elif code. Okay, if the elif Boolean is false, at that point, we will run the else code. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a quick adjustment here to this code that we were looking at. So I think we had w greater than 12 and w greater than 8, and then we started with w equals 10. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to insert an else. You can actually have a combination of an else if and an else. So this would run into alternate code. So it would check the first Boolean. If the first Boolean is true, it just runs the first section of code. If the first Boolean is false, it checks the second Boolean. If the second Boolean is true, it runs the second block of code. If the second Boolean is false, it goes over to the else, okay? And you can have as many stacked ifs, you can have as many stacked else ifs if you want. So what you would do is you could say w is not large here, and you can try this out with different values, right? So here for w equals 10, it would run this line of code. If you said w equals 1, it would run the else code, right? And then you can have as many of these as you want. So you could say else if, and you could have another one. So you could just say w is medium, right? And then now you could have another one here. So now if you run w equals 3, it would go ahead and say that the first Boolean's false, so skip the first print. The second Boolean's false, so skip the first print. The third Boolean's true, so go ahead and run the third block of code and forget the else. So it's only going to latch on to exactly one of these. If you have an else, it's certainly going to run one of them. If you don't have an else, it might run one of them, but at most, only up to one of these is going to run. So that's basically the architecture of if and else if, and a few more pointers about Boolean variables. Hopefully that makes sense to you. Go ahead and try your own examples, and then we'll pick up in the next video with more content. So from UMilso3, thanks for watching and please subscribe.